In this video we're going to look at working with layers in the software. Layers are a really useful way that we can manage our 2D data. I'm going to start by giving you a quick slideshow so we can discuss some of the concepts and issues associated with layers. Then we'll go into the software and look at some of the ways that we can actually use them and control them in practice. So starting here, the first question really is, what are layers? As I mentioned, these are really a way to help you organise your 2D data when you're creating a design in the software. Type of things that go on a layer are your vectors, bitmaps or images that you import into the software, dimensions that you create, and if you're working in Aspire or VCarve, then the component grayscales, basically the 2D grayscale representation of 3D objects. So what is it that makes layers useful when creating a part? Well, let's take a look at some of the main ways that people will use them. And these are by no means an exhaustive list or necessarily the way you'll use them. It's really just about understanding how they work so that you can best fit them to your workflow. Most common thing that you're going to do with a layer is use it to help you keep organised. As you're working on a part and it becomes more complex, then it can be advantageous to temporarily switch off some of the data you're working with. The layers allow you to do that because you can toggle their visibility so that they can be undrawn and the data can be hidden when you're not working with them, or you don't need to select them for toolpathing, say, but then you can switch it on when you do need to access it. Another way that layers help you stay organised is the ability to assign a particular colour so that all the vectors on a layer have the same colour, and it makes it easier to differentiate between them and what you're using them for. You can also give layers a name, and this again helps you to organise it in such a way that it makes sense to you. It may be that you just put like objects on a layer and give it a name you recognise, or it may be that you use them to help you organise it in terms of how you're going to machine it. So perhaps all the objects you're going to drill will go on one layer, all the objects you're going to pocket will go on another layer, so on and so forth. Again, there's no right or wrong way to do this, it's just about what makes sense to the way that you work. A very powerful way the layers can be used in the software is with something called the vector selector. On all the different toolpath strategies, you have this option to automate the selection process for what you're going to machine with that particular toolpath. One of the ways you can do this is to say that you want to machine objects on a particular layer, and this is very beneficial when you come to automating some machining tasks. For instance, if you work with machining cabinets, then this can be a very useful tool, and this is dealt with in a few of the different tutorials. Let's look at some specific facts about layers. First thing is that any 2D object can only be on one layer at a time. It's not possible to share that across different layers. If you want to do that, you need to make a copy of the object to place that copy onto a different layer. When you create any new object, it will be placed on what is currently the active layer. That's indicated by bold text that you can see here, and the fact that the little piece of paper icon here will be more visible than it is on the layers that are not active. It's only possible to have a single active layer, and as you create objects, whatever the active layer is, that's where those objects will first be placed. Once an object is on a particular layer, that won't change unless you move it or copy it onto another layer, or unless you do an operation that creates a new object, and in that case that new object will be placed onto whatever the active layer is. So for instance, if you take a vector that's on one layer but you currently have a different one active, then when you offset it, that offset vector will be placed onto the active layer, not on the layer from the object that was offset. Now, one thing that you will see in the 2D view are toolpath previews. Now, these are a special kind of objects that are not assigned to a layer, but the visibility of those can be toggled using the checkboxes next to the toolpath name in the toolpath list. So they're not on a layer, you can't make those invisible by toggling any of the layers, you have to do that from the toolpath list. So that's the one 2D entity that isn't governed by the layers. So now we understand a bit more about the layers and how they work. How do we create them? Basically, when you start a new part in the software, there'll always be at least one layer. You have to have a minimum of one layer in any part so that you can create 2D objects and that the software knows where to put those objects. So if I start a new part, there'll always be something in the layer manager called layer 1. If I want to add to that, then there's a button on the layer manager called Add New Layer. I can simply click that, that will add a new layer, I can give that a name, and now I've got a different layer in order to place objects onto. Another way I can create a new layer is to move or copy objects onto a new layer. Again, the software will prompt me for a name in that case, and when I give it that, that new layer will be created. If I import an image, then that will automatically create a layer at the top of the layer manager, and that will be called bitmap layer. The reason it appears at the top is so that that doesn't overlay the other objects in the part. If I import a vector file such as a DXF, DWG or SKP file that has layers saved in it, so when it was saved from another CAD system or maybe a part you've exported from your Vectric software, it will recreate those layers in the layer manager. And so they'll automatically be populated, the colors of the original layers and the names will be picked up, and the vectors that you've imported will automatically be placed on the layers that they were saved in. If we import a PDF file, and that has multiple pages in the document, then a separate layer for each page in the document will be created. So if you don't see the data you're expecting when you import a PDF, it's worth going into the layer manager to see what's there because it may be on a layer that you can't see. When we import an EPS or an AI file, that does not have layer information in it, and what the software will do then is just create a single layer with all the data on from that file that has the same name as the imported file. Some of the functions in the software give the option to place the objects that you're creating on a layer. For instance, when we create dimensions, then we have the option to place those on a particular layer and specify a name, and the same with the vector texture creation function as well. There are some other functions in the software that will automatically generate layers. The plate production tool will do this, and in the programs that will work with a 3D model, then if you create a zero plane, that goes on its own special layer, the grayscale for that, and also when you slice an object, slice a 3D object, then the grayscale for each of the slices will also be placed on its own layer. So, what are the best ways to use layers? Really, there is no right or wrong way to use the layers. You should utilize them so that they suit the way that you work. Really, they're all about helping you stay organized, or in some cases they're helping you automate certain functions, particularly within the toolpath inside of things. Do you have to use layers? Absolutely not. If you don't want to, you don't have to use layers, but what you will find is even simple projects will often benefit from using them. There's no better way to help keep your work organised, to allow you to work on simple, manageable parts of a project without getting overwhelmed with the amount of data that you can see or what you're trying to think about at one time. The good news is that the layers are used extensively throughout the video tutorials, so you'll see many different ways that these can help you stay organised or that they can help you save time for different applications. So now we've discussed some of the general concepts behind layers. Let's go into the program itself and get into the detail of how we actually work with the layer manager and some of the functions that are available from there to help us manage our work. Let's just minimize the presentation, start a copy of the software if you haven't already. Now let's create a new file to work with, and I'm just going to make this 12 by 12 by 1. Not really too concerned with the size here, it's just for demonstration. We'll go ahead and hit OK. Now there are a few different ways that we can access the layer manager. On the drawing tab here you can see that we've got an area called layer over on the left, and next to that is a box with a drop down arrow. If I click on that, then that's one way that I can access the layer manager here. So I can see the current layer, there's just a single layer because we've got a new part, and that's currently called layer 1. I have various tools that I can access through that, and we'll look at those later. Have a button to add a new layer, and then I can close that as well. Another way that I can access the layer manager is to come down to the bottom here and click on the layers tab. Now what I can see is the same thing, so this is the same layer manager, but obviously there's a much longer list here, or the potential for a much longer list, and also there's a couple of options that aren't available in the short version. And that's the ability to work with sheets at the bottom here, and that only concerns you if you start to do things like nest parts onto multiple sheets. But at the top we have the up and down arrow that allow us to adjust the order of the layers in the list, and this is only available from the Layers tab here. Now, as with any of the tabs, I can click on the top of this and drag it off in order to create a separate window, or if I want to completely separate it from the Drawing tab, I could click on the tab at the bottom and drag that out there. So now I've got a Drawing tab and a Layers tab, and really you're only going to do this if you've got enough screen space, or maybe if you're running multiple monitors. If you do have, then it is quite a nice option to be able to get easy access to the layers and to the other icons at the same time. Let's just click and drag the Drawing tab back into position over on the left. Click and drag the layers over as well there. And there you can see now again we've got the Drawing tab and the Layers tab here. One quick way that you can access the Layer Manager at any time is the shortcut key combination Control and the letter L. If I hold down Control and hit L, you'll see the Layer Manager is automatically opened there. And even if the tab on the left, the Design tab, is minimized, that will pop it out and fix it into place when we hit Control L. So again, another nice way that you can access that quickly as you're working through your part. Within the Layer Manager itself, the first part here allows us to toggle the visibility. The second allows us to choose a color. The third here shows me whether the layer is active or not, and also whether it has anything on it. At the moment we have a blank piece of paper there, so it's showing me that there's no data on this layer. Next we have the name of the layer, and then finally if I click here you can see that this opens up a menu that has various functions associated with the layers itself, and we'll work through all of these options in more detail in a moment. One of the most important things is being able to change the name of the layer. I can do that either by clicking on the layer name itself, which would allow me to type in a new name, or another way of doing that is to click on the menu here and then to choose the option Rename from there. Both of those will give me the same option. Now maybe I want to give this a more sensible name for the job I'm working on here, so let's call this Border Vector, and then just click in the background of the Layer Manager there in order to accept that. Now let's come down to the Drawing tab, and I'm going to click to create a rectangle here, and I'm just going to set this up so that it is 10 by 10 and hit create. Now at the moment I hit create, the software is going to make that rectangle, or square in this case, based on the information I put in here, but it's also going to place that on whatever my active layer is. If we close this now, just select it, hit F9 to center it there. Because I only have a single layer at the moment, then I know that's been placed on the layer there. Now I can click on the light bulb and you can see when I undraw that, the vector disappears because I've switched off the visibility for all the objects on that layer. Now you'll also notice there when I switch that off that the text for the layer name becomes red. And that's an important indicator because what that shows me is that my currently active layer is not visible. In a lot of cases that's not going to be ideal. Really, typically I want to be able to see whatever my active layer is. Certainly if I went ahead and created any other data now, then that layer would be switched on again and that could cause confusion. So whenever you see the layer name turn red, then you probably want to take a moment to just decide whether that layer should actually be on or whether you should be selecting a different layer to be your active one. In this case, let's just switch that back on again there and hit close. Now let's create a new layer, and we can do that either from the drop down here, clicking on the Add New Layer button, or I could hit Control L to go over to the main Layer Manager here and click on the bottom at the bottom, Add New Layer. You'll see that's created a new layer for me, and it's highlighted the name because what it expects me to do is now put in a name that's appropriate to what I plan to do with this layer. Now I could just leave that called Layer 1, and it's possible that all the layers I create I could just give the default names to. Generally though, it's a good habit to start to name a specific layer in a way where you're going to recognize what data you're using that layer for. In this case, I'm going to call this layer star and then just click in order to accept that. Now we can see now that we have this layer and it's now the active layer, and that shows because it's bold here and because the piece of paper icon is not faded. You can see the non-active layer has non-bold text and a faded icon there. What the icon does show me here is that layer currently has no data on it because it's blank. If we come down to the drawing tab and we actually create a star here, so I'm just going to make this 5 points, outer radius 3, inner radius percentage 38.2, and hit create, close, select that and just hit F9 on the keyboard to center it. Now that's been created on my active layer, and we can check that by taking a look at the drop down here. Now we can see there's data on that layer because we've got the shapes on the piece of paper, and I can toggle the visibility if I want to see that appear or disappear and reappear. Now the name I've given this layer and the object I've created match, but they don't have to. That's just because I'm trying to organize things in a logical way. I could have called this layer anything and I could have made any shape there. So it's important to understand that they're not related at all, other than the fact that that was the active layer when that object was made. One way you can tell what layer any object is on is to select it from the 2D view, and notice at the bottom of the screen here you can see first of all its width and height being displayed, but also this little indicator L here will give me the name of the layer the object is on. If I select the square, we can see it says border vector. If we select the star, we can see it's on a layer called star. So quite a useful way for me to see what layer's something on if I'm opening an old part perhaps, or if I've got a part which has become complicated enough for me to need to do that as I'm creating a design. If we come back over to the layer manager, something else we can do to help us identify what layer things are on is to give that layer a color. So we've seen we have the visibility toggle at the start here. The next, these little squares with the drop down arrow will let us choose a color. We can either choose from the standard palette here or click more colors in order to get access to more variation and colors there from the standard Windows color picking options. In this case I'm just going to click the drop down there and we'll choose say orange, and now you can see that the little indicator there is turned orange, and also the vector that's on that layer has also turned orange, and if there were multiple vectors on that layer they would now all be coloured orange in the 2D view. Now let's come back down to the drawing tab. We'll create another shape. This time I'm going to create a circle. I'm going to set the centre point of this circle to be at x6 and y10, and we'll just make it a diameter of 0.5 inches and hit create and close. Now you'll notice that circle is orange, and that's because our currently active layer is the orange layer called star here. So it's been placed on the same layer as our star. If we toggle the visibility you can see both of those disappear. At any stage that I decide, I may want to move or copy a vector onto a different layer. To do that we just select the vector or vectors that we want to move, right mouse click on them, and you come down to the bottom here, you can see we have the option to copy to layer. So that would keep a copy of it on the original layer, but then create a copy of that on whichever layer I selected, or a new layer if I wanted to. Or, as I want to do in this case, I just want to move that so that that will remove it from its current layer and put it onto whichever layer I select from the list here. Or if I want, I can click the option to create a new layer for that to go on. If we do that, it'll pop up the box here. I can give the layer a name. I can choose a color for it here, so let's pick a kind of a light blue color there, and I can also choose whether after I've created it that layer is going to be visible or not, and whether it will be active or not as well. If I uncheck both of those, then the object will disappear because it will have been placed on a layer which is not visible. If I check them both, it'll be visible afterwards, it should change colour, and also the new layer I create will become the active one if this box is checked. So if we hit OK and look over here, we can see our currently active layer shown in the drop down is now called circles. Click and just see that for ourselves. If we close and just click in the background here, we should be able to see that that object we've created is blue in order to match the color that we selected for that particular layer. Let's come over to our layer drop down and let's click on the star layer to make that our currently active layer. We can just click on the name there, or I can click on the menu here and choose the option to activate there. Now that's active, any new things I create will go on that layer. But what I want to show you is how certain things will be placed on that layer if we sort of change their state. So here I'm going to take this circle. So remember, the circle was created on the circles layer and that's where it currently is. If I come down here and click on the option to create a circular array of copies, I'm going to set the rotation center to be 6 and 6, and I'm going to set that I want to make 20 copies total angle, and I'm going to ask the software to group these copies together. That means that after it's created them, it will group them, and that in effect is like creating a single object that contains all those vectors. So if I hit copy and close and click, what we're going to see is all those circles are orange. And that's because when we created that group, it went on the currently active layer, which is star. So star is orange, all these objects are orange, because when I click on them, they're individual they don't act as individual vectors anymore, they're acting as a group, and that group is on that layer. Now if we come to ungroup them, so with that selected I can right mouse click, come down to ungroup, and I get two options. If I ungroup onto the groups layer, then those would go back to being individual circles, but they'd remain on the star layer. If I ungroup back onto the original objects layer, you'll remember that that came from the circles layer, and so what will happen it will ungroup those so they become individual circles again, so they're no longer in the group, and that they've been placed back onto the circles layer. So you can see that's why they've turned blue again, to match the color of that layer. Likewise, if I use an object that's on one layer to create a new object, the new object will always go onto the currently active layer. So here you can see our current layer is still star. If I select the object here, we know that's on the border vector layer, but if I come down and click to offset that, let's just go outwards by 1/4 of an inch, create sharp corners, let's go ahead and hit offset and close. You can see that that offset is orange because it's been placed on the active layer, which is star. So even though the object I offset was not on that layer, because this is current and active, that's the layer that the new object will be placed onto. If that was a mistake, then I can easily just click on this now, right mouse click and say move to layer and choose the border vector layer from there, and now you can see the colors change because it's been placed on that layer we just chose. Let's come down to the Layers tab again and click on that, and let's look at some of the other options we've got here. So I mentioned earlier that on the Layers tab we can adjust the order of these. So if I wanted to take the star layer and move it down, I can click on the down arrow with that selected, or I can click the up arrow to move it up or down again there till it's back to its original position. Under the menu here we've got various other options. If we click, we've talked about the fact that I can activate a layer from here, so if I click on that one, the border vector layer becomes active. From within the same menu we've got various options for showing and hiding combinations of layers. I can show that layer, which will basically switch it on if it's not. I can show only that layer, which will switch off all the others. I can show everything except that layer, or I can just switch all of them on from here. So if I say show only this, what happens there is that layer remains switched on and all the other layers, the visibility is toggled off. If I click in here and go to hide, I can say hide this layer or hide all. So if we hide that, you can see that now we have no visible layers. So I could either click, go show, and pick show all from there, or another way of doing that is to click on the light bulb at the top here, which will just toggle all of them on or off. If we've got data on a layer that we don't want to accidentally select or move or edit, then we can come over and click on that layers menu here and choose the option to lock it. So if I lock the border vector layer, you'll see a little padlock will appear next to its light bulb, and now I can't select that vector or either of those vectors, and therefore I can't do anything to them. So if you've created, say, construction data or something and you don't want to accidentally select or edit it, then it's a good idea to lock that particular layer. If we come on here and click on a locked layer, then I have the option to unlock it, and now you see I can select and I can edit the vectors on that layer again. Another option we can choose from the menu there, if we click here on the menu for the circles layer, is to insert a new layer, and that will be placed immediately above the layer you've clicked on in the list. So there it's asking me to provide a name for that if I want. I'm just going to click and accept the name there, and show you that another option there is to click and delete a layer. Now if a layer has nothing on it, it will just automatically be deleted without giving you any warning. If I was to take one of these layers that has some data on it and choose to delete it, the software will say to me that that's got data on. Do I want to move that data onto another layer and allow me to choose from the list here, or do I want to just delete the data on that layer completely? So in this case, let's move the data onto the star layer. So if we hit OK, circles layer has now been deleted, but the data that was on it has been moved onto the star layer, and so it's assumed the color of all the vectors on that layer. The other options under the menu there are the ability to rename a layer. Click and then we can edit the name of that layer if we want. The option to merge visible that we'll come back to in a minute and show you, and the ability to select the layer vectors. If I click that, it's just going to pick every single vector that's on that layer. So if I do it for the star, select layer vectors there, it'll deselect everything else and just select all the vectors that are on whichever layer menu I've clicked on there. So quite a nice option, particularly if you're keeping your vectors organized, to allow you to easily pick everything that's on a given layer. We talked in the presentation part at the beginning of this tutorial about how sometimes layers can be generated by certain functions. One of those functions, if we come down to the drawing tab, is the dimensioning. If we click add dimensions to the 2D drawing, then I have the option of various different dimensions I can create here, and then I can choose to place those dimensions on a layer. Here the default is just to place them on a layer called dimensions. Even though we don't have a layer called that, that will automatically be created if this option is checked. So for instance here with the length dimension checked, if I come in, click a couple of points here and raise this up and then hit close, we can have a look here, and now we can see that that's added a layer called dimensions there, and if we toggle the visibility, that's where those dimension vectors have been placed. Another tool that does this is the vector texture command. If we do something like select the star here, come into the vector texture pattern, I'm just going to take the settings that I've already got in here and we'll place these vectors on a layer called grain, hit preview and OK. Then we can see again that's just created a new layer for us. In this case it's actually made that layer active. So again we could just toggle that, change its color, rename it, do anything that we can to a layer that we generated ourselves in the layer manager. Another operation that will create a layer is importing an image. We come up and click on the icon here to import a bitmap, select from the project folder there this coffee mug JPEG and hit open. We'll see our JPEG's been imported there, and if we look at the layer manager you can see I've now got a layer called bitmap layer. Whenever we import an image it will be placed on that layer, and that layer will be created at the top of the list. And the reason for that is so that it doesn't obscure anything else in the list, so that it always in effect sits behind everything else. And that's really what the order of the list does for us, is determine which things are going to be more prominent. The further towards the bottom the objects are, the more visible and to the front they'll be. Let's go ahead and close that now. If we wanted, actually, if we come to the layer manager, we could toggle the visibility of that there as we can with any of these other layers that we've just created. Same way we could delete them, we could start putting more data on those now, or any of the other operations we've looked at in the video. Last thing I want to show you is how we can generate multiple layers at once by importing a file that was saved from another CAD system that had a layering system in it. We come up here and just say File, Close. I don't want to save that file there. I'm going to create a new file here. We'll just stick with the same parameters. Click on the icon here to import vectors, and I'm going to choose a file called old widget vector, and this is a DXF file, and that is a file type that will support layers. If I hit open, we can see we've imported our object here. If we click on the layers tab, I can see that this is made up of multiple layers. Let's just click here to deselect. You can see what's on the different layers by the color. We could also use the visibility icon now to switch these on and off the same way that we could if we created this design ourselves and created the layers as we went along. Now you'll notice here that we've also got a couple of layers with nothing on. We've got our original layer in the part, layer 1, and that's always created no matter what we do when we start a new part. There's also an empty layer in this DXF file called 0. That's quite common as well. Now it shows that there's nothing on each of those layers because the paper next to them is blank, and this allows us to actually use one of the functions in here to tidy up some of these empty layers if we want. Let's just switch off the visibility of the bottom 3 layers here, and then for this outline shape layer I'm going to click on the menu and I'm going to choose the option to merge visible. That's going to take any of the layers that's visibility is currently toggled on, so all the layers we can see with the light bulbs on, and when we click on it, it will just merge them into the last, or the layer that I've clicked on there in the list. So now all the data on those other layers will have been placed onto this one and they'll be deleted. In this case, because there's no data on those, it hasn't changed anything. It's just helped me very quickly tidy up my list so that now I've only got the layers that actually have data on them. And with that, it concludes this video on layers and using the layer manager. As I mentioned before, you'll see lots of the tutorials where we use the layers to help keep the work organised, and also some of them where we show you how they can be a great time saver when it comes to some of the toolpath operations as well. We'd highly recommend getting familiar with the layers and starting to use them in your projects, even on simple things, because getting to know how they work on a simple project will help you to learn how to use them when they become most important, and that's when you're making something more complex. Thanks for watching.